and welcome to the Good Leader podcast. I'm Will Vanderhart, and in this series of stress traps, we're exploring areas of life which, when addressed, can potentially alleviate some of the pressure and stress of leadership in the future. And I'm delighted that for a second session in this series, we've got consultant psychiatrist Chichi Obuaya. Chichi, welcome back.
Thank you, Will. Good to be here.
It's great to have you here. We said last week we were discussing issues around the need for boundaries, working towards exhaustion and burnout and self-awareness. And I thought it'd be great to ask you some questions around managing, if you like, that's probably the wrong word, but exploring mental health and the church. And many of the leaders that I work with in the network are very concerned for the mental health of people in their communities, and they want to grow mental health friendly churches. But the reality of that can sometimes be quite challenging, particularly if they have maybe a mismatch of expectations to the realities of the people that they're working alongside. And I would love to ask you some questions as both a Christian leader and as a psychiatrist about what's it look like to experience mental health in the context of the church? What really is mental health? How might we define it?
Well, maybe I could pick up on your slip of the tongue, Will. We don't need to manage. And I think that's one of the dangers, that there's this sense that as a church leader, one has to be a mini psychiatrist or psychologist and to actually do the managing. I think the key point is that we need to brush up on our knowledge of what's going on in the mental health space. And I think there are roles that the church has in signposting people for help, in encouraging people who have mental health difficulties to feel really valued. And in some respects, the church has some unique offerings it can make to the space. So it's a two-way relationship. So firstly, let's start with thinking about the range of mental health conditions.
Yeah. Because
it's vast. And I think in itself, it's quite overwhelming for church leaders. Most, I imagine, will be more familiar with anxiety and depression, which are very common. And so we tend to think of these, to give the title, as the neurotic conditions.
Yeah.
At the other end, we have psychotic disorders, so conditions such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder. These are conditions which affect reality testing. So what I mean by that is that people have experiences which are not normal for them. The classic example would be hearing voices when there doesn't appear to be anyone physically around. Often people who have psychosis will be under the care of specialist mental health services, and that may or may not be the case for people with neurotic disorders. I think we also, in a church context, struggle with other conditions which we hear about a lot in the press, like personality disorders. We all have personalities. I think I can also say that most of us can be quite challenging in our personalities at times. And within a church context, there will be people with personalities that cause conflict. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have a personality disorder, which is a rather loosely defined condition in which there are long-term difficulties in interpersonal relationships, and that person often has a rather diminished sense of self. So it manifests in very erratic, chaotic and dysregulated behaviour. On top of that, we have problems with addiction, which some people may experience. So just thinking about that, there's a lot that church leaders may face, and I think just having greater knowledge of the range of conditions and having an understanding of the range of support people may experience is really important as a starting point.
Gigi, that's so helpful to hear, and it's kind of helpful just to, in a way, segment some of these into a kind of framework and go, okay, I understand now what the range of mental health might look like. Just you saying that just reminds me of how ill-equipped or maybe inappropriate it is that we as church leaders try and offer more than being that alongside pastor. I always think, if as a church leader, if someone came to me and said they had a very complicated brain tumour I wouldn't Google treatment of brain tumour and then offer them some suggested remedies. But people often do that with people with mental health disorders, don't they? They offer advice more than they maybe should. Is that something that you notice?
I think that's very, very much a true statement. The challenge is that our mental health affects our behaviour, and we are relational beings, so it is something that is going to either directly or indirectly be put at the foot of the leader in that context. And it's often our natural inclination to want to do something. So I think the first thing to say is that sometimes there isn't actually a call for a response. Sometimes just being with an individual. If we think about grief, this is a good example of a situation where there may not be a specific word that needs to be given. It might be physical touch, hugging someone, or just spending time with them and hearing them. We don't have to have a solution-focused response. I think that's the first thing to say. But also, I think it's important to think about the wider context in which people require help. So as a psychiatrist, and it's always interesting that people talk about the medical model, which is often used as a derogatory term to suggest that as a doctor, all I'm interested in is going to be prescribing medication for somebody. We're trained to think very holistically. So we refer to the biopsychosocial model. That means we recognize that the causes and the treatments that we can offer may fall into different categories. Biological, so that would include medication, but it also understands that for some people there may be a family history of a condition which makes someone more likely than the general population to have that condition. And psychosocial factors are huge. So thinking about social deprivation, poverty, these things can all impact on mental health, and they can be part of the treatment package. So if someone is in an unsafe environment, moving to safer accommodation, having access to money, like a stable job, for example, these things can all help. So you could add the spiritual component to that, so biopsychosocial, spiritual. And the church therefore has a role to support people in their spiritual health as it pertains to their mental health. And then there may be a role in bolstering their spiritual health as part of the treatment, but not the treatment, part of the treatment.
It's pretty helpful you stress and identify that, because I know there are some settings in churches where people have almost moved the biopsychosocial model you suggest away and have offered a sort of spiritual one resolution model. That's not a healthy approach.
It's a tricky one to comment on, because as Christians we believe in the power of prayer, and so I think it's not really my role to say it doesn't have any place whatsoever. I think if it's the only solution, that's where we've just got to ask whether that's the right thing to do.
Sure.
Because there may be some contexts where, of course, we want to encourage people to get prayer, but that could sit alongside seeing a counsellor, a therapist, going to your GP, having medication, doing practical things that you need to do.
So it's integrating is a good position to kind of start from.
Absolutely.
I mean, hopefully a lot of leaders watching this will I think breathe a bit of a sigh of relief when they think about a biopsychosocial spiritual model, because it takes some of the huge levels of responsibility that they feel and shares them out a little bit more. And my experience of working with other leaders in this field is a feeling that they've almost got to fix other people's circumstances, particularly in this area, which actually is unnecessary. When we were chatting before the show, you said to me that thinking about church leaders often begin from a position of thinking that a person with a mental health issue needs their help, but actually that's very often not the case at all.
Absolutely. I think there's a danger that we fall into this sort of victim mentality approach to it. And we need to think beyond that, because our friend John Swinton has done a lot of research in this area, and the idea of friendship and allyship, which are terms that are thrown out a lot these days, What does that really mean in a church context when we're talking about mental health? It means that we shouldn't just feel sorry for people and make sure they're not on the outside. Of course, those are good things. How do we truly value individuals who may have mental health difficulties? Are we thinking about them as potential leaders, people who can make a contribution, or are we just having pity on them and trying to include them? So I think we've got to be more ambitious in that respect. Going back to your point about our responsibility, I would just encourage people by saying it's something that we share as clinicians, that there's a danger sometimes we fall into that trap. Only I can salvage this situation. And it's important to remember that we work in teams. And I mean that even in a context where, as a priest or as a psychiatrist, you might work very independently. But I'm referring to a virtual team. We have to create those networks of people. For some people, they have family and friends, others don't. There may be different professionals involved. There may be different people within a church community that can support. So I'd always encourage people to get away from a situation where it feels as though you're the only person that can support that individual. But you have to be creative to generate that network sometimes. And if you're not sure, the best thing to do is to ask the person. Who else do you speak to? Who else have you told about this? Where do you gather your support from? They may have friends they play sports with, and they're part of that virtual network. So we have to think broadly, but not get too concerned that it's all on us.
That's really, really helpful. And I love the principle of recognising that so many of the people who join us in church contexts who have a diagnosed mental health condition are also incredibly talented and gifted. In fact, the church itself is founded on the shoulders of people like Mother Teresa or John Bunyan or Charles Spurgeon, all who had diagnosable clinical mental health conditions. No one would question their value or what they offered. I think that's certainly true today.
Absolutely. But the challenge lies in, I think, being explicit that we want to support people who might be going through those difficulties. And I always want to encourage leaders to think about the cultural changes that could be implemented. And if the perception is that one steps into a church, everyone's smiling, everyone's always happy, they seem to have 20 children who are all happy and gifted and never have any problems and are always smiling on their Instagram feed, where is that creating the space then for people to talk about areas of difficulty? And if the worship is always really uplifting, which is a good thing, but if it's always like that and there isn't any reference to or space for lamentation, where does someone go when they're struggling? So it's just about encouraging people to put themselves in the shoes of those people who might be struggling and think about how that then impacts on initiatives, how the service is set up, how outreach is done, and just coming up with practical solutions for that.
So this is about thinking about our churches with greater differentiation, depending on where people are coming from, which is helpful regardless of mental health condition. Everyone has good days and bad days, everyone has struggles and moments of difficulty, everyone experiences grief. So that's really helpful to think about the emotional fabric of the church as being a differentiated emotional experience as well as a kind of one-stop shop to joy. But what we've said today, we're sort of exploring this idea of responsibility in leadership, I think is really, really important because so many of our leaders have such a heart to see people do better, but then feel like they just can't make the change happen that they want to happen, if you like. If you were addressing them directly, Gigi, what would you say to them to encourage them as they try and support the well-being of people in their communities?
I'd say it's not a solo mission. So if you're trying to change the culture, have a look around and see who you've got on your team. You may not even know who they are yet. Yeah. But what resources do you have internally to bring about that shift? And also, what resources do you need to support you? Because the work can be burdensome, and it's important to have other people in similar leadership positions who you can speak to openly about areas of challenge and get practical advice, but also get that emotional support so that you can take that somewhere. Because when it weighs heavy, I think it's important that you do something with it, otherwise you're going to be taking that home, and that's where it wears people down.
Amazing advice, Chichi. Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for being with us today on the Good Leader podcast. I hope you found that as informative and insightful as I did, as we all think about how we can support those with mental health conditions within our churches, communities, and businesses. We do hope particularly today you take away this idea that you're not responsible for the well-being of everyone, but also that other people who maybe struggle with their mental and emotional health can be a support to you, that we are all valuable members of the same community together. And I hope that this is the foundation of some really important conversations, both amongst yourselves and your colleagues. God bless you and have a really great day.